The star was added to the U.S. flag. The morning Florida became a state. There were no fireworks, no grand speeches, just silence, thick like the mist that clung to the oaks. But something shifted that day, not just in law, but in blood, land, and memory. And most people alive never knew what it cost.
They say a new day began for Florida on March 3rd, 1845, but I remember it differently. Not like something that started, more like something that was decided for us. That morning I rose before the sun. The crows hadn't stirred yet. The fog still hung low over the river banks like an old quilt pulled tight over secrets best kept hidden. Our little town, if you could call it that, was awake in strange ways. The bakery was already sending out the scent of burnt sugar and bread. The horses were restless, as if they knew history didn't sit easy on their land. I walked the narrow dirt path that led down to the square. Red clay caked on my boots, cypress trees bent over like they were eavesdropping on the earth. And maybe they were, because if anything had ears that day, it was the soil. Florida wasn't empty land back then. It wasn't blank space on a map waiting for stars and stripes. It had memory. The memory of the Calusa, the Tequesta, the Appalachee, who had carved their prayers into shell and wood long before any white man set foot on it. The memory of the Seminole, still hiding in the green shadows of the Everglades, refusing to bow. And the memory of those brought in chains, dragged from ships and scattered like seeds, buried alive in cotton fields and citrus groves. "We finally got our star," someone said as I passed the cavern. "Number 27. He grinned, teeth yellow, hand on his hip like a proud uncle. "We're Americans now," said another. I didn't say much, just nodded and walked on. I'd seen what the word American meant to different people in this place. To the man with land, it meant loans and lumber. To the preacher, it meant God's blessing, manifest destiny, they called it. To the boy shackled behind the jailhouse, American meant his freedom was a joke no one was brave enough to laugh at. The bell rang for the courthouse gathering around midday. I took a spot near the back, by the old oak where slaves used to be auctioned off. No one talked about that anymore. They'd built a flower bed there. They called it Progress. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "by the will of Congress and the grace of Providence, we welcome Florida into the Union of these United States." Cheers followed. Hats flew up. A band started somewhere with out-of-tune brass. But the man beside me, old, dark-skinned, back bent like a question mark, just muttered. "Union don't mean much when your family's still sold like cattle." I turned, met his eyes, deep, distant. "You fought in the Seminole War?" He nodded once. "Fought for both sides. Neither remembered me." The speaker went on about prosperity and law and the honor of becoming a state, but the soil beneath our boots didn't stir. It remembered war, the raids that burned homesteads in the north, the swamps where white men drowned chasing warriors they couldn't see, the women who buried sons without names. "Mama says we'll get a school now," a little girl whispered beside me. She had red ribbons in her hair, boots too big for her feet. "Mama says we'll get a real doctor, too." I smiled gently. Maybe you will. Maybe she would. But somewhere behind us, a man was coughing blood into a rag outside the blacksmith's. No one looked. That's the way Florida was then. Half dream, half fever, half promise, half punishment. A place where new beginnings were written on the backs of the broken. And that day, March 3rd, 1845, we just added ink to the parchment. They called it statehood, but to the land and to many of us it felt more like a rehearsal for something worse. And the crowd began to thin. Some went home proud, some went home scared, some just went home. I stayed watching the flag rise slowly above the courthouse, red, white, and blue, right against the gray Spanish moss. I wondered if the soil cared. I wondered if the trees would keep their secrets. And I wondered, as I always did, what kind of country builds itself on silence?
Part 2. The Price of the Star. They raised the flag, and by the next morning it already meant something different to everyone who saw it. For the men in tall hats and fickle wallets, it meant power, a fresh round of land grants, federal subsidies, and new rail contracts. For the small town folk, it meant structure, a post office maybe, a schoolhouse, a bridge that wouldn't rot in one season. But for the ones with no names on deeds, no names in ledgers, no names on their own birth papers, it meant something else entirely. Something harder, something heavier. For them, that flag felt like a noose tied in red, white, and blue. Over the weeks that followed, the land began to change. Surveyors arrived in dusty wagons, pulling long chains behind them like the ghosts of what Florida used to be. They chopped into forests, drew crooked lines on perfect green. They didn't ask what already lived there. They didn't care what bled under the soil. They brought maps. And when the map said something now belonged to a man in Charleston or New Orleans, then that was law. If there was a family living on it, a Seminole, a freedman, a widow, it didn't matter. The ink was heavier than their blood. This was Spanish land, a farmer named Hatch told me one morning as we watched men put down railroad stakes. He spit tobacco and smiled like he'd earned it. But even he looked over his shoulder now and then, because no man walks comfortable when he knows his house was built over a ghost. In the swamps to the south, where cypress knees rise like fingers reaching out of graves, they said the Seminoles still lived. Not all were gone, not all were dead. The army had tried to drag them west, to Oklahoma, to nowhere. Some went, some fought, some vanished, but some stayed, beneath the moss and mist, in silence. There were nights when fires would flicker just beyond the tree line. No sound, no voices, just a flicker and then gone. The white folk called them savages. I called them survivors. Mama says don't go near the glades after sundown. Why not? Because the ones they couldn't catch, they remember what we did. I didn't ask who we was. I rode west weeks later, following the path of the Moo Railroad crews. They laid timber like they were cracking the earth open, building through sacred ground as if nothing had ever existed before. Near Tallahassee, I passed a makeshift town of tents. Slaves, laborers, poor Irish men with blistered hands and broken boots. The wealthy watched from covered porches, drinking from frosted glasses, while others built the future for 'em.
Some of the workers disappeared. They said it was heat stroke, or fever, or carelessness, but I knew better. When men go missing and nobody files a report, it's not an accident, it's a system. "You know what I miss?" said a man with hand like cracked leather. The other replied, "Not hurtin'." They laughed, quiet and hollow. "They promised us wages," the first said. The second said they promised us God, too. Guess neither showed up. Meanwhile, the cotton fields expanded. Florida's soil, black and rich, turned white every harvest. The new planters came from Georgia and South Carolina. They brought slaves with them in wagons, children sleeping in burlap sacks, women clutching Bible pages, men with fresh lashes on their backs. Statehood made it legal. Statehood made it profitable. Statehood made it feel inevitable. I passed one of the new plantations one night. No one saw me. A child was sobbing behind a chicken coop, no more than 5. A woman hushed him, wiped his cheeks with a threadbare cloth, and sang low, "Oh freedom, over me." It wasn't just a lullaby. It was a prayer. That's the thing they don't write in the documents, in the proud announcements to Congress or the new state constitutions. They don't mention the babies born into bondage the week Florida became a state, or the families torn apart to settle debts, or the Seminole boy watching from behind a mangrove tree as his village disappeared from the map. All those stories erased in the name of unity. "You ever wonder what it means?" an old man asked me, rocking slowly. What means?" I said. "A star on that flag." He pointed to the sky. "Out there they mean hope, navigation, destiny. But down here sometimes they just mean somebody else got claimed." The days passed. The roads filled. Florida was no longer wilderness. It was becoming a machine, built by people that didn't own their own names, directed by men who only saw numbers. But the land didn't forget. The winds still blew through old forts. The trees still whispered in languages lost to empire. And me? I kept listening. Florida became a state, but it came at a cost written in silence, in sweat, and in soil. And that cost, it was only beginning.
Part 3. Storms on the Horizon. By 1850, the air in Florida had started to feel different, thicker, tighter, like holding your breath in a church before someone confesses something awful. The fields still bloomed white every year, cotton growing like clouds on the ground. The train whistle still cut through the morning mist. The steamboats still came in from Savannah and Mobile. But the people, they had changed. They stopped talking freely in public. Newspapers stopped reporting the full truth. Neighbors who once borrowed sugar now crossed the street with their eyes down, because something was coming. Everyone felt it. No one could say it. Some blamed the North. Others blamed the federal government. Most never read a law in their life, but they knew when fear moved into a man's house, he'd start blaming shadows. And slavery? It had gone from an unspoken fact of life to a line drawn in the dirt. You were either on one side of it or the other, and every day the line got sharper. "They want to take our way of life," said a merchant at the general store. "What they want is to run things from Washington, tell us what a man can and can't do with his property."
"A man ain't property," someone said quietly. The room went still, and that man never spoke in public again. In the Panhandle, where the soil was blood red and the air hotter than any honest breath should be, they started holding meetings. Quiet at first, then louder. They spoke of sovereignty, of states' rights. They used words like nullification and defense. What they meant was war. I remember reading one of the leaflets nailed to the courthouse door. "We must not allow the meddling hand of abolition to poison our young republic. The time for Florida to stand with her sister states is near." They said it like a sermon, like a wedding vow, like prophecy. But to me, it felt like a funeral. "They making plans," an old woman whispered to me once as we watched a group of men ride past on horses, muskets strapped to their backs. "But the land already know what's coming. Ain't no vote gonna stop what's under the ground." I asked her what she meant. She just pointed at the earth. That dirt had been fed by too many bones. By 1860, the election came like a thunderclap. Abraham Lincoln won without a single Southern vote. To the people in power, that meant only one thing. The North had finally shown its hand. And to them, that hand was a clenched fist. By January 1861, just weeks after South Carolina seceded, the vote was held in Tallahassee. Florida became the third state to leave the Union. The ink dried fast. Flags came down. New ones went up. Drums beat in the streets. Church bells rang. And for a brief moment, it felt like a celebration. But if you listened closely, under the noise, there was weeping. A boy no older than 15 marched past me in a ragged uniform made from curtains. He carried a rifle too big for his hands. He asked me, "You think it'll be over quick?" I lied. Maybe. But I saw the fear behind his bravado, and I knew Florida had just walked into a storm that wouldn't pass for decades. The night Florida seceded, I stood again at that same courthouse where they raised the American flag 16 years before. It was gone now. In its place flew a different banner, new colors, same blood underneath. The flower bed was gone too, dug up for a cannon emplacement. Progress, they'd said before. Now they said defense. But all I saw were holes in the ground. I went down to the river that night. The fog was thick again, like it had circled back around to swallow everything we had built. And I could hear frogs calling. The water lapped like a slow heartbeat. And in the dark, I could still see them, the faces of the ones who had watched this land change hands again and again. The ones who had no vote in any of it. The ones who knew statehood wasn't the end, only the beginning. They'll tell you Florida became a state in 1845. They'll say it was a triumph of civilization, a moment of unity. But I was there. I watched the ink dry. I heard the silence that followed the cheers. And I know better. Florida didn't become America that day. It became a version of America, one built on promises kept for some and broken for everyone else. And now, when I walk that same dirt path past the ruins of that courthouse, I can still feel the storm that never really left. Because history doesn't die here. It just goes quiet for a while, until someone starts listening again.
Stars are easy to sew onto a flag. It's the stitching of wounds, the binding of stories, the reckoning with ghosts. That's the hard part. Florida became a state, but it never stopped being a question.